Hello and welcome to Time Trek. I'm your host, Peter Connor, and in today's episode we're discussing the top 5 nations of the world in the year 1900. Now, just a few clarifications about what I mean about that. What do we mean by a powerful nation? What do we mean by the top 5? Well, obviously in today's world we'd look at nations like China and America. Americans have the #1 economy in the world at the moment. China has the largest military in the world. Basically we're looking at the nations that had the largest economies and were the power players of that era. The 1900s was smack bang in the age of imperialism. This is when imperialism was at its absolute height. As well as an age of imperialism, it was known as an age of rapid technological development. This is the age of the telephone, the kinescope. The telegraph system had been established for 60 years by this point, connecting the world together. This is the era when technology really is advancing at an incredible, remarkable rate, improving the lives of countless numbers of people all over the world and just changing the lives as well of a good number of people all around the world. As well as an age of technology, it was the age of nationalism. This was an age when nations around the world sought to improve their own standing through nationalistic tendencies. Obviously, this was part of the reason that led to the horrors of the Second World War, when nationalism probably went to its extreme. But nationalism at this time was leading to many issues for many nations around the world, with peoples and ethnic groups believing that they had the right to govern themselves rather than being part of any multi-ethnic, multinational empire. The thing that characterizes this era, around the year 1900, and what historians call this era, is the Gilded Age or the Belle Epoque era. Both mean the same thing. The Gilded Age is the American term, the Belle Epoque is the more European term. Basically, it was an era in which the ultra rich owned and controlled the vast majority of nearly everything. Politics was governed and directed by big titans of industry, the 1%, and they were able to capitalize on this wealth through these rapid technological changes that allowed them to make the factories. So they were taking advantage of these technological development in order to make themselves lots of money. But we're coming towards the end of the Gilded Age. The Belle Epoque at around the year 1900 is coming to a close because it is coming towards the Progressive era. Teddy Roosevelt, who will be president shortly after McKinley gets assassinated, he's seen as the beginning of the Progressive era in America, and obviously progressive policies were to come in the other European nations as well. Creation of a welfare state pensions in the People's Budget of 1912, for instance, in Great Britain. But the thing that's underlining all this era is what economic historians call the Great Divergence. In simple terms, is for most of human history, China and India were the economic powerhouses of the world. They had the most people, the most resources, and they probably had the biggest technological advantages over other European nations. That's why China and India were the powerhouses of the world. Europeans longed after Chinese and Indian goods. That's why the Silk Road came about. But obviously, since around the year 1600 to 1700, there's some debate about when the Great Divergence took place. The European nations rapidly overtook. Indeed, as one historian notes, in 1900 Europeans could look back on 2, perhaps 3 centuries of astonishing growth. Most of them would have said that that growth was for the better, that is, progress. Now, whether the African nations and Asian nations that were being economically exploited by the Europeans in the year 1900 would agree that it was progress, I don't think they would, but certainly the people of Europe and America probably at this time would have called this progress. So we have gathered that this is an age of European domination, this is the age of imperialism and a rapid technological development that is changing society at a fast, very quick rate. So without further ado, I guess we'll get on to our number 5, and the first nation we'll be talking about in today's video. So I'm not gonna lie, to be honest, this nation was by far the trickiest nation for me to put into this list. Picking number 5 was by far the hardest choice. Again, this is all my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. Who knows? Please don't shoot me for my opinion. But in my opinion, my number 5 choice is a nation that doesn't even exist anymore. It is the only nation on this list that doesn't exist anymore. All the other nations do exist. But my number 5 choice is the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Gott erhalte Franz den Kaiser, unseren guten Kaiser Franz.
Now, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had been suffering some struggles. Obviously, notably, it was a major European player up until around this time. It was probably a much stronger European power, probably at its height, perhaps more a century earlier, because it had been suffering from nationalism. One of the big problems Austro-Hungarian Empire suffered was it was multi-ethnic, multinational, multilingual, and in the age of nationalism that this was, it led to a lot of nations wanting to seek independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, more notably in the Hungarian half of that empire. Indeed, as one historian says, strains in the Austro-Hungarian Empire where nationalism presented a real revolutionary dagger in the lands within the Hungarian half of the monarchy. So, as I say, overall, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was obviously nowhere near as powerful as these other 4 nations that I'm going to be discussing, but I do think it benefited from the Great Divergence, obviously benefited from some industrialization at this point. You had cultural centers like Vienna, people like Sigmund Freud who were completing his work around this time, a good cultural export there that was obviously going to have repercussions for decades or centuries to come. Obviously, as well as this, Vienna had a great art scene, music scene, and was definitely seen as a good cultural centre of Europe at this time. Which brings me on to number 4. My number 4th choice is France. Now, France has a large overseas empire by 1900, encompassing West Africa, areas of the Far East, and parts of the Caribbean. All of these territories provided France with sufficient capitals to sustain a large domestic market, as well as maintaining a trading presence abroad. Though France was much less efficient than Germany in industrializing, because of this, France struggled to compete industrially with its European rivals at this point. France managing only a GDP growth of 1.63 between 1870 and 1913 compared to Germany's 2.81 growth. So, as we can see, France, I think, obviously started the 19th century in a better position than other nations, but obviously was a bit slower to industrialize and therefore was probably playing catch up a little bit to some extent by the year 1900, but obviously since they'd started from such a height, obviously perhaps being the great power of the world in the Napoleonic era, obviously they are still a huge power player in the world in the year 1900 and still a very important nation on the world stage. In terms of cultural things going on in France, we've got the Paris Olympics, which took place in 1900. France itself, in terms of its domestically what was going on in the year 1900, well, France is still rocked by the Franco-Prussian War of 1871 and the loss to the Prussians in that war. So they were still reeling from the loss of the Franco-Prussian War. This was a war in which Emperor Napoleon III at the time, he, and I quote from a historian, "The French emperor felt he could not resist the popular clamour for a war which he feared and was to lose." As one historian notes about the time, and he says that France and Germany were psychologically deeply sundered by the transfer of 2 provinces, Alsace and Lorraine, to Germany. in 1871. Politicians of that era and time are still kind of wanting to get Alsace and Lorraine back and seeing it as a national humiliation that needs to be corrected, as well as the internal squabbles about how to deal with the loss of Alsace and Lorraine. France was also deeply rocked by the Dreyfus Affair. The Dreyfus Affair, to put it shortly and succinctly, was a Jewish officer was accused of handing over state secrets to Germany, and the French imprisoned him in an island that was considered quite a horrific place to imprison a person. And the debate was whether it was too harsh or not harsh enough. Was this anti-Semitic or was it not anti-Semitic? And clearly we can see from the Dreyfus Affair that anti-Semitism was not just a problem in Germany that was to come, it was a problem throughout all of Europe. So France is a nation still reeling from that loss of the Franco-Prussian War, divided by some internal politics by the Dreyfus Affair, and it's looking pretty economically secure with its empire, feeling a need for revenge from that loss to Germany, and that's going to power it through to the First World War, as we will see in deadly consequences to come. That brings me on to number 3, Germany. Germany was a nation that didn't even exist 30 years earlier. It existed theoretically, but not in the nation state that it became and was in the year 1900. Germany industrialized quicker than any other nation in the 19th century. This meant that by the end of the 19th century, Germany had emerged as a major world power, providing competition for other European superpowers. Germany was more advanced in organization and mechanization than industry had been in Britain. Indeed, by 1913, Germany had beaten Britain in having the largest gross domestic product in the world, a sum of 237 million at the time. Indeed, Germany had industrialized fast, which was causing tensions and nervousness with other nations around the world, most notably Britain. But Britain remained its largest trading partner, and both nations benefited from each other despite the growing suspicion of each other. Indeed, 50% of its workforce was in agriculture in 1870. This is compared to just 10% of its workforce being in agriculture by the year 1920. Wilhelm II had been pushing nationalistic projects such as the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, and its strong and growing navy had begun to worry other nations like Britain, which made it a mighty economic military power, because obviously the navy was the super weapon of that era. So yet Germany is a nation that is industrializing fast and moving away from an agricultural economy by the year 1900. Between 1870 and 1900, Germany's output of pig iron increased 6-fold, while its population only increased by about a third. Whereas nationalism had gone against other nations in helping them progress, nationalism obviously had some benefit towards Germany in forming it as a nation in the first place. Bismarck declaring new German nation a nation founded in iron and blood. But where Germany is not quite as advanced as the other nations is in its imperial ambitions. Obviously it does have a moderate empire at this point, but nowhere near the size and scope of the French or the British Empire. And this was something that the German people and the German politicians were looking on enviously at. Obviously the Berlin Conference had been founded in 1885 as a way to bring all the European nations together and stop them avoiding conflict with each other in carving up Africa. But obviously that had only led to limited colonization for Germany, and Germany, it just did not have an empire that could compete with, again, the British and the French. But one advantage that the German nation did have over other nations like Britain is it did have a large standing army of conscripts, it had a conscription system, and it had and could muster one of the largest armies in the world. And this is a foreshadowing of things to come and the eventual First World War, which is looming over all this period. And that brings me on to number 2. Can you guess which nation it is? Is it a surprise? I bet you could probably know what my top 2 is now. Obviously, it is America. The USA, the United States of America, to give it its full title. The 20th century was the American century. We all know by the end of the 20th century, America was the economic military powerhouse of the world and the undisputed world power. But in the year 1900, it is not quite the undisputed world power that it was by the end of the century. It is a young nation that is growing and industrializing rapidly, as well as the other European nations at the time. Indeed, by 1913, the USA had the largest gross domestic product in the world of $517 million. The USA between the years 1870 and 1913 also had the fastest rate of growth of GDP of 3.94%, nearly 4% growth each year of its gross domestic product. Rapidly growing, rapidly industrializing nation at the time. However, it is also important to note that although the USA was a serious economic power, they didn't have the same overseas presence that the other European nations had. The USA, it was endorsing its imperial tendencies that the European nations had also forged by the year 1900. Of course, we have the Spanish-American War of 1898, which was a war which was founded on the pretext of a lie, probably, in the blowing up of the Maine, the US Maine, which is most probably an accident, but yet they used it as a pretext to go into that war, which allows the USA to economically control Cuba for the next 50 years, annex Guam into America, and annex the Philippines as part of America as well. As well as this, they'd also annexed Hawaii and made that an American overseas territory by this point. So it's fair to say that America also had that imperialistic bug. Of course, you've got the Gilded Age coming towards a close, but there are still men like Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, the big titans of industry that are still pretty much running America at this point. In terms of cultural things that's going on at the time, we've got a woman called Carrie Nation. She is running around America with an axe into saloons and destroying saloons. She was a wife of an alcoholic who died. Of course, this is a pretext for the prohibition, but it's also a pretext for the women's rights that were becoming more and more important at the time. In terms of what's going on in politically in America at the time, we've got a Republican dominated White House. This is the era when, following the Civil War up until the First World War, the Republicans would have pretty much control of the White House, with William Grover Cleveland just interrupting that a little bit. But in terms of the shape of the two parties, we've got the Democratic Party moving away from being a party of the planter class, obviously pre-Civil War, towards being a party of the working class under William Jennings Bryan, a man that ran for president 3 times and lost all 3 times, but he did successfully manage to reshape the political philosophy of the Democratic Party, a less conservative party and a more progressive party. In terms of the Republicans themselves were concerned with tariffs and trade under McKinley, but then under President Roosevelt embraced some more progressive ideas about breaking up monopolies of certain industries. Exports doubled under President McKinley, so we can see that this America is a rapidly growing industrializing nation at this time. They are truly entering the world stage and becoming an undisputed superpower. We got got Louis Lassagne invented the hamburger in the year 1900. I don't know why no one thought of putting a slice of beef between two burger buns before, but God bless Louis Lassagne. So America has a lot of advantages that is going to allow it to become the world superpower of the 20th century and allow it to economically and culturally dominate the 20th century. It has a very large population, much larger than every other European nation. It is a country that is isolated. By the end of the First World War, America would become the world's creditor. Obviously, it's going to take advantage of them technologies that are developing, such as video, which will allow it to create Hollywood and the cultural powerhouse that Hollywood became for America. Which brings me on to my number one nation in the year 1900, and is of very little surprise. We are still right in the middle of the Pax Britannia. Of course, I'm talking about Great Britain. Great Britain was fueled by a rapid increase in international trade and a growing middle-class demand for consumer goods. Indeed, Britain had 22,000 miles of railway in 1900, the largest in the world at that time. As well as this, Britain's overseas territories gave access to a wealth of resources and new trading opportunities all around the world. London was also the economic capital of the world during this period, due to the sheer scale of trade and profit that flowed into London. However, it is also true that Britain had lost its title as the workshop of the world, now facing serious economic competition from its continental rivals as well as its former colonies across the Atlantic. So Britain is a nation that is both at once jubilant at being the number one nation in the world, full of pomp and circumstance. 1897, it is the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. It is a moment of pure, unadulterated celebration, but behind the scenes there are men who begin to think that the cracks are beginning to show, that Britain no longer completely rules the waves, that perhaps the economic consequences that had led to it being in its fortuitous position were about to end. So how had Britain become the number one nation in the world at this time, with the largest navy and the largest economy in the world in the year 1900? Well, many politicians were looking at the reason as to why this was, and realizing that some of these advantages that it did have were beginning to end. Britain was the first nation ever to industrialize, and obviously this was a tremendous and important reason as to why it became a massive economic powerhouse in the 19th century. Being the first nation to industrialize allowed it to be the first nation to do things on a large scale, to manage logistics, to send people halfway around the world and set up colonies there. So obviously this was still right in the middle of the age of imperialism, and Britain was expanding its empire at this time, if anything. By 1900 it was the largest empire the world had ever seen. As well as this, a huge population boom of this period that gave it access to a larger workforce. But these advantages that Britain had of industrializing first and having this large population as a consequence, all that was coming to an end by the year 1900. By the year 1900, other European nations were beginning to compete with Britain, obviously as a consequence of the rising tide of nationalism. They were facing some fierce independence battles from some nations and from some people's groups, most notably at the time in the humiliation that became the Boer War. Now, the first Boer War in around 1881 had been unsuccessful for the British, and a bit of humiliation that time round. Then in the second Boer War, the Prime Minister at the time, Lord Salisbury, in 1900, we're a couple of years into the second Boer War and it seems to be going going well for the British. The British had lost their imperial redcoats, the famous redcoats at the time. They'd switched towards khaki uniforms, so the election of 1900 became known as the khaki election. Lord Salisbury called the khaki election of 1900 because the Boer War seemed to have been won at that time. It seemed that most of the major cities that had rebelled against the British had been re-established under the British, but the Boer War became a long protracted war against the Boer peoples in South Africa. We had the British setting up concentration camps, because in this new type of guerrilla warfare, if everyone can be seen as a soldier, then the opposing government begins to see a distinction between civilian and a soldier as becoming more and more blurred, and everyone eventually kind of gets treated as an enemy first in this type of war, and we get the first concentration camps set up by the British, and Britain's having to send in a force 8 times as big as the Boer force in order to eventually see off the Boers. This showed to the world that the British Empire was not invincible, that the British could be defeated, and that, you know, cracks in the empire were beginning to emerge. If just a small group of farmers essentially could take on the might of the British Empire and almost win, then what would happen if Germany did, or other nations did? And that was what nations were beginning to ponder by the year 1900 as the cracks began to show in the British Empire. The Boer War ended up costing the British £211 million at the time. It was the most expensive war going from the Napoleonic era up until the First World War, when obviously the First World War became more expensive war. That's about £20 billion in today's money, so an incredible amount of money had to be put into the resources of empire, and the resources of an empire were not producing the economic boosts that, say, India did a century or two earlier. There's a tendency in some to see this era as a glorious era of Britain being an unadulterated success, but Britain was a nation of have and have-nots at the time. There was a large group of peoples that were the working classes that were treated and lived in horrible conditions. Indeed, one of the first social scientists ever of this period, Charles Booth, he started mapping the poverty districts of London, and using a much lower poverty threshold than we have today for government statistics, he concluded that 33% of London was living in poverty. And indeed, work by the Joseph Rowntree a couple of years later, he found out that up to and around 47% of all potential recruits were being turned away for ill health or malnutrition or simply poor health. So some in the Victorian London slums suffered in absolute horrible poverty. Quite clearly, Britain and the Empire could be divided into a nation of haves and have-nots, as people lived in absolute squalor and horrendous conditions in some parts of Victorian Britain. As well as this, Britain was not immune to the rise of nationalism that was taking place at the time. It was in a much better place than other nations to deal with this, but it did have a big significant challenge, and this was probably most notable from Ireland and the question of Irish Home Rule, which had divided the Liberal Party a generation earlier in the 1880s. They'd been divided over the question of Home Rule, which had led to an era of conservative dominance in the politics of Britain at the time. But of course, it was not just the Irish Catholic population of Ireland which were demanding independence, which was causing a problem for the British. It was also, as I quote one historian, the Protestant majority of the province of Ulster which was excited to threaten revolution if the government in London gave them Home Rule to the Catholic Irish nationalists. So these were essentially the Protestants of modern day Northern Ireland, which were also threatening violence if the Irish Catholics, as they saw it, were granted home rule. So not only were they suffering the problem of nationalists wanting to break away from Britain, they were also suffering from the problem of nationalists not wanting to break away from Britain, which of course would lead to, and this is the beginning of the Irish Troubles, which would plague Ireland all the way up until the Good Friday Agreement. So as we can see, by the year 1900, although British power is not quite what it was under men like Palmerston and his gunboat diplomacy, essentially going around and demanding every other nation on earth do what Britain wants, Britain is still still the number one power in the world at the time, though it is facing economic competition from the economic cultural powers of Japan and obviously America. We can see in terms of technological change that for instance the 36,000 horse pulling trams in Great Britain in 1900 had only 900 successors in the year 1914. So we can see that the engine and the car automobile and the electrification of the train lines and tram systems was about to revolutionize public transport in Britain at the time and revolutionise society as we know it. So in conclusion, although the year 1900 seems like a very remote, distant place to the world that we live in now, with its world of imperialism and nationalism, it is a world that is much like ours today in terms of its rapid technological change. Much of the technology that we have today was around by the year 1900. Indeed, by the year 1914, educated Europeans and Americans took for granted anesthetics, the motor car, the steam turbine, harder and specialized steels, the aeroplane, the telephone, the wireless, and many, many more marvels which had not existed a century previously. Their effects were already very great. So yeah, a period of rapid change and rapid technological development that nations were struggling to keep up with at the time. But it's interesting to see where the power players of the 100 and odd years ago, where they were compared to where they are now. Of course, we know America and their rise was yet to come. Other nations would be declining, such as Britain. Germany perhaps would be still yet to grow, and other nations wouldn't even exist, such as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So that'll about do it for today, but thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button, and if you could subscribe as well, that would also help the channel out massively. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching till the end of the video, and until next time, goodbye.